Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, we're traveling back to the dusty, wind-blown edges of the American frontier. In this episode, we're exploring the horrors of 1800s medicine in the Wild West. It's a world of whiskey as anesthetic, bone saws without mercy, and doctors who sometimes did more harm than good. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Whether you're curled up under warm blankets or just closing your eyes after a long day, this story is here to keep you company. So settle in, breathe deep, and get cozy as we head into a time where frontier survival meant pain, grit, and a whole lot of guesswork. They rode into towns with names nobody remembered, carrying black bags full of hope and horror. Most were not doctors by training, but by declaration. In the vast, unforgiving stretch of the American frontier, medicine was less a science and more an act of desperate improvisation. A man might have once apprenticed with a physician back east, or spent a few weeks in a hastily assembled medical college with little more than a chalkboard and a stack of outdated anatomy texts. Others had no formal education at all, only a collection of tools, some charm, and the confidence to announce themselves as healers. Medical schools, where they existed, often focused more on volume than rigor. Diploma mills flourished in cities like Philadelphia and Chicago, issuing certificates to anyone with enough money to pay the fee. The curriculum, if it could be called that, varied wildly. Some schools barely lasted a year, offering students a rush of lectures on humoral theory and the occasional cadaver dissection, assuming they could secure a body. There were few regulations to slow the spread of these so-called doctors, and fewer people willing or able to check their credentials. Out on the frontier, need outweighed suspicion. The sick did not ask about diplomas. They asked about relief. Gunshots, fevers, childbirth, snake bites. Everything came through the same creaking door, and the man or woman who claimed to be a doctor had to face it all. There were no hospitals, no clean sheets, no reliable supplies. Just grit, a few instruments wrapped in cloth, and whatever courage could be mustered in the face of agony. Mistakes were frequent, success was rare, and most days ended with the sharp smell of whiskey covering both fear and failure. In this wild and unforgiving environment, the doctor was part physician, part gambler, part actor. Their reputations lived or died on word of mouth. A patient's survival wasn't just a win, it was marketing. Those who did well might be called to the next town. Those who didn't might ride out in the middle of the night, leaving behind a grieving family and a fresh grave. There were no second chances in the Wild West, only the long road ahead and the next door waiting to be knocked on. The land itself demanded resilience. Dust choked the air, and summer heat seared wounds before they could scab over. Winters offered no mercy either. Ice crept into lungs and turned a simple cough into a death sentence. In this place, pain was a constant, and medicine became a matter of endurance rather than understanding. For frontier doctors, survival meant more than keeping their patients breathing. It meant learning when to cut, when to cauterize, when to walk away, and when to lie through their teeth. They treated everything, from bullet holes in a gambler's thigh to the bloodied mess of a ranchwoman's miscarriage, with the same set of tools and the same dogged determination. The treatments were crude. Pain was managed with whatever was available: whiskey, laudanum, or a thick piece of leather to bite. In many cases, the procedures caused more harm than the ailments themselves. Amputations were fast, brutal, and done without understanding the invisible dangers of infection. Instruments were rarely cleaned, passing from one patient to the next with nothing more than a wipe on a blood-stained apron. Yet despite the staggering odds, some patients lived, and when they did, it was attributed to grit or God or the doctor's steady hands, even if chance had played the biggest role of all. There was no specialization. The same hands that stitched together a cattle rustler's scalp might, hours later, guide a child into the world, or pull a decaying tooth from a trembling jaw. Illnesses that modern medicine could treat with a simple prescription were catastrophic here. Strep throat might become rheumatic fever. A mild wound could swell, turn black, and lead to a rushed and desperate amputation. Typhoid and dysentery spread through camps and settlements like fire through brush, and most doctors could do little more than advise rest and hydration, though clean water was often a fantasy. When the outbreaks came, they came like smoke, thick, fast, choking everything in their path. Still, people begged for doctors. Even those who had lost loved ones to a failed surgery or an overdose of a mislabeled tonic would send word the moment another family member began to sweat and shake. They knew the risks. They had seen the blood. Yet the alternative, doing nothing, felt like surrender. And out here, where storms rose from the plains without warning, and outlaws rode with guns drawn, surrender was not in the language of survival. Medicine in the Wild West was not a matter of healing. It was a matter of hope, ragged, raw, and often cruel. But hope nonetheless. The doctor rode on, sometimes with the same bandaged hand he had used to hold down a seizing patient the night before. Sometimes with empty saddlebags after using his last bottle of quinine on a child too far gone to save. He would arrive in the next town or mining camp and be met with eyes full of desperation. And he would try again, because that was the job. There were no lab coats or sterile gloves, just blood, sweat, and the terrible weight of being the last chance someone had before the fever took them for good. Before the microscope, before antibiotics and germ theory, medicine was built on an idea as old as Hippocrates. The body, according to ancient wisdom, was governed by 4 humours: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Health depended on keeping those fluids in balance. If a man collapsed with fever, it meant his blood was in excess. If a woman grew pale and fainted during childbirth, the conclusion was the same: too much blood. The cure was to take some of it out. By the time doctors began riding into the American frontier in the 1800s, the belief in humoral balance had already endured for centuries. It was taught in medical schools from London to New Orleans. Physicians in the Wild West, many of them untrained or only partially trained, clung to it because it was what they knew. It gave a name to the chaos inside the human body, and it offered a way to intervene. Bloodletting was a ritual of control in a world where disease often mocked any attempt to stop it. It began with the pulse. A frontier doctor might sit beside a sweating patient, 2 fingers on the wrist, brows furrowed in thought. He was not counting beats per minute. He was searching for signs, an irregular rhythm, too strong, too weak, proof that the blood was surging where it should not be. From there, the next step was clear. Open the vein, let the excess drain out. The idea was simple and dangerous. Bleeding was supposed to cool the body, to restore its internal harmony. But without an understanding of how infection spread or how much blood a person could safely lose, it often made things worse. People grew dizzy, fainted, sometimes slipped into unconsciousness, and never woke up again. The methods varied, each more unsettling than the last. The most common was venesection. The doctor would tie a tourniquet above the elbow, choose a vein, usually in the forearm, and slice it open with a lancet. The blood would rush out into a bowl or soak into the dirt floor beneath the chair. Sometimes it was measured carefully. Other times, it was simply judged by the doctor's eye and experience. If a patient grew pale, that was taken as a sign the imbalance was correcting itself. If they vomited or began to shake, it was a sign that more blood should be drawn. And if they died, it meant the disease had won, because treatment had come too late. For those who could not withstand the blade, there were leeches. They were purchased in jars, kept alive in water, and stored like medicine. Some doctors swore by them, claiming they were more precise than the knife. A leech would attach to the skin and feed until it fell off, engorged and writhing. Some patients endured dozens of them at once. The creatures were placed behind ears, on the neck, the lower back, even inside the mouth. There was no sanitation, no gloves. Doctors would remove the leeches by hand, flicking them off with fingers sticky from other procedures. Infections followed. So did scarring, bruising, and occasionally a blood clot that lodged where it shouldn't and ended a life days later. Then came the scarificators, a tool so mechanical and cruel it felt out of place among saddlebags and whiskey flasks. It looked like a small metal box, with a trigger on top and a series of tiny spring-loaded blades within. When activated, the device would unleash the blades in rapid succession, cutting shallow lines into the skin. These lines would then be bled, often using suction cups placed over the wounds to draw out more fluid. It was marketed as efficient, modern, even scientific. But like every other bloodletting device of the age, it operated on a guess, a blind reach into the body without understanding what lay beneath. And yet, people kept asking for it. Because what else was there? A fever that would not break, a child with shaking limbs, a mother after childbirth, pale as ash, her body limp with exhaustion. Bleeding felt like action. It felt like doing something in a place where too often there was nothing that could be done. No one could see bacteria. No one could trace the invisible passage of disease from dirty hands to open wounds. But they could see blood. They could control it. That illusion was powerful. In the frontier towns where time moved slowly and death came quickly, the belief in humours and balance gave people a sense of order. Doctors who practiced bloodletting were not monsters. They were people trying to help, using tools and theories handed down to them across centuries. They did not see the damage they caused because it hid in plain sight, explained away by superstition, bad timing, or the will of God. The science was wrong, but the faith was real. And on those long, empty plains, faith was often the only medicine left. The tools of 19th century medicine did not whisper promises of healing. They shouted pain. They gleamed with the cold confidence of certainty and carried the weight of centuries of tradition. Most were made of steel, unpolished, unsterilized, and wrapped in cloth that reeked of old blood and alcohol. A doctor's kit was not much larger than a shoebox, yet it held the power to save or to destroy, though no one at the time could clearly tell which outcome was more likely. The lancet was the most familiar. Its short, triangular blade rested inside a wooden or ivory handle. shaped for speed and repetition. In the hands of a frontier doctor, it was used with the precision of a butcher's knife. A flick of the wrist opened the skin, releasing blood in thick streams. The blade did not have to be sharp. In fact, many were dull from overuse, dragging instead of slicing, tearing through flesh with a quiet resistance that made patients scream or go silent, depending on how far gone they already were. These tools were rarely cleaned. Sometimes they were wiped on a sleeve. Sometimes they were simply tucked away until the next use. Rust collected at the joints. Cracks formed in the handles. But as long as they still cut, they were kept in service. Leech jars were another staple, made of glass, sealed with cork or cloth. They were filled with dark water and the slow writhing of parasites waiting to be called upon. Doctors carried them over bumpy roads, through snow and dust storms, doing their best to keep the creatures alive. If the water got too warm, the leeches would die. If it was too cold, they would stop feeding. Yet even under ideal conditions, they were unpredictable. Some refused to attach. Others latched on and would not let go. There were stories of leeches migrating into body cavities, disappearing down a throat or upper nostril, lost in the very person they were supposed to treat. Once, a child in Missouri choked to death on a leech that had been placed under his tongue to cure a fever. His mother said she heard a wet fluttering sound just before he stopped breathing. The doctor had already moved on by then. Then there were the scarificators, brutal devices that resembled something between a music box and a trap. They were made of brass or iron, with a lever on one side and a hidden array of blades inside. When the lever was pulled, the mechanism sprang to life, releasing the blades in a rapid burst that sliced shallow lines into the skin. The sound was unmistakable, a sharp metallic snap that echoed through the room like a warning. The wounds it made were small but numerous, and the pain was sharper than the lancet. These cuts were often placed in a grid pattern across the back, chest, or limbs. Once the bleeding began, suction cups made of glass or horn were pressed over the area to draw more fluid from the body. The suction was created by heating the cup with a flame, then pressing it to the skin so the cooling air would create a vacuum. Skin would rise into the cup, purple and bloated. Sometimes it blistered, sometimes it tore. If the cups were cracked, the vacuum would break. If they were too hot, they burned the patient outright. Even then, the doctor would rarely stop. Most of these tools were bought through catalogues or from traveling salesmen who carried them from settlement to settlement. There were no regulations, no standards for design or safety. One blacksmith's scarificator might differ wildly from another's, but the result was always the same: pain, blood, and the hope that it would be enough. There was something ritualistic about it all. The preparation of the instruments, the careful placement of towels, the bowl at the ready, the patient breathing heavily, eyes wide with dread. In the absence of science, medicine became performance. The tools were the props, and the stakes were life and death. And the aftermath was just as brutal. Patients were left weak, shivering, soaked in their own sweat and blood. The wound sites, often left uncovered or wrapped in the same bandages used on previous patients, became infected quickly. Pus oozed from the cuts. Flies gathered in the warmer months. In the winter, the wounds festered in silence beneath thick coats and wool blankets. The doctors blamed the illness, the lateness of the call, the weakness of the constitution. Never the tools, never the method. The frontier was a place where pain had to be endured. There were no soft hands, no gentle recoveries, just the blunt edge of survival and the steel that cut through it. The implements of medicine in the Wild West did not reflect a failure of compassion. They reflected the limits of knowledge. The tools were designed to help, wielded with a kind of desperate conviction. But every lancet, every cup, every blade hidden inside a scarificator served as a reminder of how far medicine still had to go, and how many would bleed before it got there. There was a bottle for everything. Bottles lined the shelves of general stores, doctors' offices, and travelling wagons that rattled their way across the vast plains and canyons of the American West. The glass was often tinted brown or green, thick and misshapen from hurried production. Labels curled at the corners, boasting gold-trimmed lettering and bold, sweeping names. Dr. Kilmer's Swamp Root, Lydia Pinkham's Vegetable Compound, Kickapoo Indian Sagwa. The names were theatrical, meant to catch the eye of a farmer's wife or a coughing railroad worker who didn't have time to wonder what any of it actually was. Every bottle promised the same thing: relief. From aches, from sorrow, from the creeping terror of death. In the 19th century, patent medicines filled a void. Real doctors were scarce. Hospitals, if they existed at all, were untrustworthy or out of reach. Disease spread faster than news, and once it arrived, people would take anything that offered a flicker of hope. That hope often came in liquid form, infused with the strange alchemy of alcohol, opium, morphine, and sometimes even cocaine. The ingredients were rarely listed. When they were hidden in language so vague it was meaningless. Herbal essences might mean belladonna. Secret proprietary blend could be laudanum thickened with turpentine. But people bought them anyway, because what was the alternative? The advertisements worked hard to convince. They filled newspapers with testimonials, sometimes genuine, more often invented. A farmer claimed his rheumatism had vanished after one bottle. A grieving mother insisted her colicky infant had finally slept through the night, thanks to Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. No one asked what was in the syrup. They didn't need to. It worked. The baby slept. And if the child never woke again, the grieving parents were told it was the illness, not the medicine. The dosage had simply come too late. These miracle tonics travelled farther and faster than most trained physicians. Salesmen arrived in towns with bright wagons and louder voices, their coats dusted with road dirt and their pockets lined with glass. They staged shows, complete with music, banners, and costumed assistants pretending to faint or collapse before being revived with a dramatic swig from the bottle. It was theatre. It was survival. They offered a cure to every pain: indigestion, melancholy, menstrual cramps, heartbreak, even old age. And people bought it because suffering was real, constant, and deeply personal. The West was filled with wounds that could not be seen. Some of these medicines offered temporary relief. Many contained high concentrations of alcohol, which dulled the senses and quieted the mind. Others numbed pain through narcotics. Cocaine was added to cigarettes and lozenges marketed as throat treatments. Heroin was blended into cough syrups and pain relievers. The line between healing and addiction blurred until it vanished altogether. No one had the vocabulary for dependency yet. They saw only what the bottle promised: calm, clarity, escape. The most successful patent medicine makers became rich. They built factories and funded their own newspapers. Their names became synonymous with health, even as their products slowly destroyed the very people who trusted them. There were no federal regulations, no medical boards stepping in to test or verify their claims. The market was wide open, and the Wild West embraced it with both hands. Desperation made easy prey. Even those who suspected the medicines were dangerous still bought them. There was a kind of defiant hope in the act. It was better to drink something than to do nothing at all. Better to feel a burn in your throat than to sit helpless beside a child's fevered body. In a world where doctors bled you and nature beat you down, a sweet-tasting tonic that offered peace in a bottle seemed almost divine. And so the bottles multiplied. They clinked in saddlebags and lined the back of bar shelves. They were passed from hand to hand, neighbor to neighbor, mother to daughter. Some were tucked away after a single use. Others were drained dry in a matter of days. People kept buying, kept drinking, kept hoping. And all the while, the labels smiled with the same promises they had always made. Cures for every ailment, relief without question, salvation in syrup. In the silence that followed, no one dared to ask what price had truly been paid. The pain did not disappear. It only changed its shape. What began as a tonic to soothe the nerves or ease a cough soon became something else, something harder to name. People drank for relief and then kept drinking because they could not stop. They took pills for sleep and found they could not wake without another. The lines on the label, written in looping script with words like elixir and compound, never mentioned what happened after the third bottle, or the fifth, or the 20th. No one spoke about the shaking hands, the wild eyes, the days that vanished into a fog of sleep and sweat. The advertisements showed smiling children and radiant women. They never showed the ones who wasted away behind drawn curtains, begging for another dose. Addiction was not a word used in those days. It lived under other names: melancholia, nervous exhaustion, weak character. When a man who had once been a sharp-eyed rancher could no longer hold a cup without spilling it, people said the frontier had worn him down. If a woman grew pale and jumpy, trembling at shadows, the neighbors blamed the wind, or the loss of a child, or too many long winters in the dark. What they did not say, because they did not understand, was that these people had been poisoned slowly by the very remedies they trusted to make them whole. Morphine lived inside the blood like a ghost, always hungry, always whispering for more. In homes across the West, there were drawers filled with brown glass bottles, some still half full, others empty except for the residue clinging to the corners. Mothers gave their babies syrups to keep them quiet through the night. The babies slept, heavy and still, and when they woke, they cried with a sharpness that pierced through walls, and the cycle began again. There were stories of mothers who could not remember feeding their children, of fathers who wandered off during snowstorms and were found days later, frozen just a few yards from their own cabins. These were not the wild tales of frontier danger. These were the quiet deaths that came from within, hidden behind the glossy shine of miracle medicine. Some patients built resistance. The dose that once brought comfort no longer touched the pain. They drank more. They crushed tablets into powder. They mixed tonics together and drank them all at once. The stronger the mixture, the better it sold. There were no safety warnings, no instructions to limit use. If a label mentioned dosage at all, it was vague or simply wrong. There were no consequences for misleading information, no agencies to file complaints with, no doctors to monitor progress. The buyer was alone, holding a bottle that promised everything and explained nothing. Children grew up on these substances. Parents gave them for teething, for fevers, for restlessness. Some children grew used to the taste. Others developed symptoms that no one could explain. They twitched in their sleep. Their limbs went stiff. Their eyes rolled back at odd moments. Families whispered about curses, about bloodlines, about sins carried from one generation to the next. No one thought to blame the medicines that sat on the kitchen shelf beside the flour and beans. Even when death came, it was rarely attributed to the bottle. People died from exhaustion, from dropsy, from brain fever. A woman who wasted away was said to have withered from sorrow. A child who never woke was mourned as fragile, delicate from birth. And the salesman returned, smiling, tipping his hat, offering condolences and a fresh bottle for the next illness. It was a cruel loop. Desperation led to faith, faith led to dependence, and dependence led to decay. The promise was always louder than the warning. Some towns began to notice the pattern. A few doctors, the ones who studied real medicine and read the journals from Europe, started to speak out. They collected samples, documented cases, tried to raise alarm. But they were few, and the sellers were many. The sellers had money, newspapers, wagons painted with bright slogans. They had the support of entire towns built on hope and habit. No one wanted to hear that their miracle cure was a slow-burning poison. No one wanted to believe they had been complicit in their own suffering. The truth moved slowly. It did not ride in on horseback or shout from the rooftops. It crept into medical libraries and government offices. It appeared in courtrooms and scientific reports. But by the time questions started to be asked, damage had already spread across generations. The price of those golden promises was written in empty cribs, lost husbands, ruined minds, and the quiet despair of women who stared into mirrors and no longer recognized the reflection. The West had always been a place of risk. You could die from a rattlesnake bite, a landslide, a bullet. But what haunted the frontier most were the things that looked like salvation and turned out to be something else entirely. A glass bottle, a syrupy sweetness, a promise printed in elegant script. That was all it took. And by the time the promise broke, it was already too late. They came into town like storms, with banners snapping in the wind and voices loud enough to rise over the crack of hooves and creaking wagon wheels. The patent medicine sellers turned the dust-covered streets of frontier settlements into makeshift stages. People gathered because there was nothing else to do, and because deep down, most were looking for a reason to hope. These men, and they were almost always men, stood tall on wooden platforms, calling out to the crowd with the flair of seasoned performers. They wore velvet coats and gold watches, their smiles too wide, their hands moving in practiced rhythm as they pulled bottles from their satchels like magicians pulling rabbits from a hat. The show was always the same. A joke, a trick, a story. Sometimes a fire eater or a painted girl in a sequined dress. Then the pitch began. They would speak of ancient remedies handed down from wise men in distant lands, of secrets discovered by accident in the lab of a brilliant doctor now conveniently deceased. They spoke of Indian healers and mountain roots, of blessed springs and herbal miracles. Behind them, a curtain might part to reveal a man once stooped and wheezing, now dancing a jig, cured on the spot with a swig from the bottle in his pocket. The audience would cheer. The coin would change hands. And just like that, another box of hope would leave the wagon. Some of them believed in what they sold. Others knew exactly what they were doing. The clever ones kept moving, never staying in one town long enough for the side effects to catch up. They travelled under different names, reinvented themselves every few hundred miles. The frontier was a blank page, and they filled it with stories, promises, and glowing testimonials. It was easy to convince someone who had never met a real doctor, someone who had watched a child suffer through fever, or a wife limp through another winter with pain lodged deep in her spine. Easy to make them believe that a few sips from a pretty bottle could change everything. The local storekeepers stocked the medicines long after the wagons had moved on. The labels did the work now. Bright, detailed, full of language that sounded official. The words doctor and cure appeared often, as did phrases like guaranteed results, and endorsed by leading physicians. Most of it was lies, but there was no law requiring otherwise. The Pure Food and Drug Act would not arrive until the next century. Until then, the market was as wild as the land itself, unregulated, unrestrained, and driven by profit more than healing. And yet, for all the deception, people were not fools. Word spread, slowly, painfully, but it spread. A neighbour's boy who had once taken a popular nerve tonic for his stutter began having violent seizures. A widow who relied on a female remedy turned hollow-eyed and stopped speaking altogether. At first, these incidents were dismissed as coincidence. The human body was fragile. The West was hard, but as more stories surfaced, unease began to take root. Mothers stopped handing syrup to their children without a second thought. Men read the labels more carefully, even if they could barely understand them. Some began asking questions, and when they did, they found no answers. Small newspapers ran editorials. A few brave doctors published letters warning of addiction and overdose. A travelling preacher once destroyed an entire case of liver tonic in front of his congregation, calling it a tool of the devil. In some towns, there were murmurs of lawsuits, though few ever made it past the talking stage. The system protected the sellers. There were no tests to fail, no trials to lose, no licenses to revoke. All a man needed was charm, a wagon, and a supply of empty bottles. But change was coming, even if it crawled forward inch by inch. Behind closed doors in Washington, legislators had begun collecting samples, interviewing families, and taking note of rising death counts. Scientists were beginning to look into what these miracle cures actually contained. Slowly, the illusion cracked. The colourful posters faded. The crowds grew smaller. The music stopped. Still, even as suspicion grew, the sellers did not vanish. Some rebranded, others crossed state lines and started over, and many communities, isolated and desperate, kept buying. Because even when a lie is exposed, it can still be easier to swallow than the truth. In the absence of real medicine, the patent cure continued to fill a need that nothing else could. The people wanted something to believe in. They wanted a remedy to the pain and uncertainty of their lives. And the men in velvet coats were more than willing to give it to them, one bottle at a time. They knew what they were doing. Some of them. The clever ones always did. It began wherever there was space. A dining table pushed against the wall in a boarding house. The wooden floor of a schoolroom with the desks cleared. The back room of a saloon still reeking of spilled whiskey and sour sweat. Surgery in the American West had no permanent home. It happened wherever the patient collapsed, or wherever someone was willing to lend a cot. There were no gleaming white walls, no overhead lights, no trays of gleaming tools lined in rows. The closest thing to an operating theatre was a room with enough daylight to see the wound clearly, and enough floorboards that the blood could be mopped up without leaving a stain that would ruin business. frontier surgeons carried their operating rooms in saddlebags, rolled leather kits with scalpels, bone saws, forceps and retractors clinked together as they rode from camp to camp. The tools were stained, often dull, sometimes broken. Most had been used on dozens of bodies before and would be used on dozens more. There was no protocol for cleaning beyond a quick wipe with alcohol or a rag soaked in rainwater. Between patients, the tools were tucked away without much ceremony. There were no gloves. Hands that had just cut through muscle or dug lead from a man's belly would be used to eat lunch an hour later. It was not carelessness. It was normal. The patients arrived in whatever condition the West left them in. A rancher gored by a bull. A miner whose leg had been crushed beneath a falling boulder. A child with a festering infection that had started as a splinter. By the time they saw a doctor, they were already half gone. The injuries were always advanced, the wounds blackening at the edges or dripping pus. There was rarely time for diagnosis. The pain spoke for itself. Something had to be cut, drained, pulled out, or cut off, and it had to happen fast. Speed was a matter of survival, not for the patient, but for the surgeon. Every moment the wound remained open was another moment for blood to flood the floor, or for the crowd to grow restless. Surgery was brutal, and most people did not want to hear the screams. A good frontier doctor could remove a leg in under 3 minutes. If the patient was lucky, someone had whiskey. If they were truly fortunate, a cloth soaked in chloroform or ether was pressed against their mouth until their body went limp. But the doctor had to work quickly, before the patient woke or before the fumes wore off. Too much, and they might not wake at all. Too little, and they would feel everything. There were no surgical gowns, no sterile masks. The doctor's coat was often the same one he wore on the trail, streaked with blood from the last operation. Assistants were whoever happened to be standing nearby. Sometimes they were barbers or barkeeps. Sometimes they were teenagers barely old enough to hold down a terrified patient's thrashing limbs. Sometimes they were the patient's own family. One would hold the head, one would hold the arms, one would hold the legs. And then the cutting would begin. The saws were thick and heavy. They worked their way through bone with a sound that echoed in the skull. Muscles were clamped and tied with silk or cotton thread, and then the whole limb was tossed aside. There were few ways to stop the bleeding. Some doctors cauterized the stump with a hot iron. Others tied off arteries with whatever thread they could find. Infection followed like a shadow. Days later, the stump might swell and ooze and blacken. If it didn't kill the patient outright, it would leave them crippled and aching for the rest of their days. Those who survived were considered miracles. They limped through town like ghosts, hollow-eyed and stiff, carrying the weight of what had been taken. Some lived with pieces of bullets still lodged inside them, too deep or dangerous to remove. Others bore deep scars across their bellies or backs, signs that the doctor had been there and done what he could. There was no follow-up care, no clean beds or monitoring. After the cutting, the patient was sent home to rest on straw pallets, wrapped in linen that soaked through by nightfall. Families watched over them with trembling hands and whispered prayers. Surgery on the frontier was not a profession. It was a risk. Every time a doctor picked up the blade, he was gambling. With the patient's life. With his own reputation. With the chance that this time, the body might give in, or fight back, or simply fall apart in his hands. And still, the blade came out. The blade. The sleeve was rolled up. The crowd stepped back, and somewhere in a corner of a saloon, or beneath the flickering lanterns of a barn, a man tried to carve survival from suffering, using the only tools he had and all the nerve he could summon. The blades were worn smooth with use, not from polishing or sharpening, but from the simple wear of cutting through flesh, bone, cartilage, tendon, day after day, across hundreds of bodies in every condition imaginable. The instruments of surgery in the American frontier were not pristine. They were relics that clanked together in leather rolls, blades that carried the memory of past failures, handles darkened with age and fluids that were never fully cleaned away. These tools passed from hand to hand, from battlefield to back room, handled by doctors who worked by feel more than by knowledge. They were crafted with care, forged by metalworkers who knew nothing of surgery, and then handed to men who were trusted to do what they could with what they had. The scalpel was often the first to be drawn. Its edge was meant to be precise, to glide smoothly along skin and muscle. But out here, under lantern light, or in the middle of a dusty road, it was anything but elegant. A dull scalpel tore through tissue in jagged lines. A broken one could slip, drawing blood where it was not supposed to. And still, it was used, because there were no replacements. There was no one to send it to for repair. If the tip broke, it was filed down. If the blade bent, it was hammered back into shape. It did not matter how crude it became. If it cut, it stayed. The bone saws were heavier than they needed to be, with thick teeth that chewed through limbs in a grim rhythm. The handles were wood, often sticky with dried blood and sweat. The blades were rarely cleaned between uses. Sometimes they were rinsed in a bucket. Sometimes they were wiped on a rag that had been used for other wounds. Infection was common. No one questioned it. A patient who began to smell of rot was said to have bad luck or a weak constitution. No one looked at the sore, blackened at the edges, and considered it the cause. Forceps and retractors, crude in design and brutal in use, were often made by local blacksmiths. There were no uniform standards, no measurements that guaranteed precision. The claws of the retractor dug into flesh and held it apart while the surgeon worked, but the pressure could crush veins, damage nerves, and leave lasting pain long after the surgery was over. The forceps were supposed to grip, but more often they slipped. When they were used to pull bullets or shattered bone from a wound, they sometimes did more harm than good, digging blindly and tearing tissue in their clumsy search. Then there were the tree fiends, circular saws designed to cut through skull. They were used on men who had fallen from horses, been struck in barroom fights, or taken a bullet to the head. The procedure, called trepanning, was performed to relieve pressure or drain blood. It required cutting a hole into the skull without piercing the brain beneath. The margin for error was almost non-existent. And yet, frontier doctors performed it with terrifying frequency, often relying on guesswork and trembling hands. Many patients never woke. Others awoke different, altered, their memories scrambled or their speech slurred. Families whispered about possession. The doctor moved on. Bleeding cups and lancets still lived in these kits, though their use had begun to decline. Some surgeons clung to the belief that draining the body would balance its humours. Others admitted they had no idea what it accomplished, but continued the practice anyway because it was expected. These tools, small and sharp, were often nestled beside the knives and saws, tucked away in folds of leather like secrets no one wanted to acknowledge. There were no antiseptics, no alcohol swabs, no boiling water baths. If a tool was cleaned, it was usually wiped on the surgeon's coat or dipped in whiskey. Sometimes a blade would be passed through a flame, but this was more ritual than science. Germs were invisible. That made them easy to ignore, too. A surgeon could go from carving a gangrenous leg to delivering a child in the next room without ever changing his instruments. If something went wrong, it was never the tools that were blamed. It was fate, or bad air, or God's will. Despite their faults, these instruments were treasured. A doctor's kit was expensive, sometimes costing more than a man's horse and saddle. Losing one was a catastrophe. Doctors carried them through snowstorms, across rivers, and into hostile territory, always aware that without them, they were powerless. These tools gave them authority. They gave them purpose. And yet, in their use, they left a trail of pain, scars, and broken bodies. They were not weapons, though they looked like them. They were not meant to harm, though they often did. They were instruments of desperation, wielded in ignorance, crafted in good faith but steeped in suffering. Each one carried the weight of hundreds of decisions made in fear, in haste, and in the relentless pursuit of survival. They glinted in candlelight and blood, and they shaped the future of medicine not through triumph, but through the lessons learned in failure. The price was high, the damage was done, but the blades kept cutting because there was no other choice. The numbers did not lie, but they rarely made it into the official record. There were no comprehensive hospital ledgers in the middle of a desert town, no university studies conducted in makeshift cabins with blood-stained floorboards. The success or failure of a surgery was measured by whispers, by the looks on neighbors' faces, by the slow toll of graves added to the back of the churchyard. And yet, the truth was as sharp and certain as any knife in a doctor's bag. Surgery in the American frontier was more likely to kill than to heal. Amputations were among the most common procedures. A crushed leg, a shattered arm, a wound that would not stop weeping pus. All of it pointed to the same grim conclusion. The limb had to go. If it stayed, the infection would spread through the blood, and death would follow close behind. If it was taken, there was a chance. A small, flickering chance. But even then, the odds were cruel. On average, the mortality rate for an amputation in a frontier setting hovered between 1 in 4 and 1 in 2. Factors like location, temperature, and time since injury played their part. A man operated on within hours might have a fighting chance. A man who waited days, who had ridden for miles with the bone exposed and the wound crawling with flies, was as good as gone before the sore ever touched his skin. Gunshot wounds were even trickier. The bullets of the time were slower, larger, and left devastating damage in their wake. They shattered bone, shredded muscle, and often dragged bits of cloth and dirt deep into the body. Removing a bullet required precision, but the conditions rarely allowed for that. The tools were dull, the lighting was poor. The hands doing the digging were tired, hurried, and often shaking. If the bullet was missed, or worse, if pieces remained behind, infection was almost guaranteed. Even those who survived the initial surgery might spend weeks battling fevers, vomiting, and pain that made them scream through the night. Some made it, most did not. Internal surgeries were rare and often a last resort. Cutting into the abdomen or chest was seen as a near-suicidal attempt to fix something that could not be seen, much less understood. There were a few bold surgeons who tried. Dr. George Goodfellow in Tombstone, Arizona, became something of a legend for removing bullets from the intestines and performing rudimentary abdominal repairs. But he was an exception. Most doctors avoided such procedures entirely. The mortality rate for operations involving internal organs was so high that families would sometimes refuse consent. They would rather their loved one die in their own bed, surrounded by familiar voices, than be sliced open in a back room by a man with blood beneath his nails. Childbirth surgeries, when they occurred, were harrowing. A breech birth or obstructed labour might call for intervention. but few doctors knew how to handle it. Caesarean sections were performed with little understanding of anatomy or hygiene. The mother was unlikely to survive, the baby too. These procedures were whispered about with a kind of reverent horror, like dark miracles that sometimes worked but often ended in silence and blood. Midwives, who handled most births, did what they could with herbs, warm cloths, and firm hands. When a doctor was called, it was usually already too late. The dead were buried quickly. There were no morgues, no embalming in most towns. The bodies were wrapped in blankets or old curtains and lowered into the earth before the sun set, especially in summer. The causes of death were guessed. Shock, they would say. Fever, or bleeding out. Rarely did anyone blame the surgeon. The procedure had been necessary. The outcome was unfortunate, and so life went on. But the doctors remembered. They carried the weight of each failed surgery like a stone in their chest. They remembered the eyes of the wife whose husband did not wake, the sobbing child whose leg now ended at the knee, the quiet horror in the room after a mother bled to death delivering a child who never cried. They told themselves they had done their best, that there was nothing more they could have done. And in many cases, that was true. But the truth did not soften the burden. Some tried to learn. They read what they could. They wrote to colleagues in the East, asked questions, made notes. A few traveled back to cities when they could afford it, to study under proper surgeons and see what progress looked like. But those who stayed on the frontier worked in a kind of suspended time, always behind, always a few steps away from real understanding. They operated out of necessity, not mastery. Their statistics were written in graves, in rumors, in the lines that deepened around their eyes year after year. Surgery without sterility was a game of chance played with blunt tools and hope. The survival rates reflected that. The frontier did not forgive mistakes, and it did not wait for medicine to catch up. It simply pressed forward, leaving behind the wounded, the broken, and the dead, while those who remained tried to stitch together meaning from the mess. They kept cutting because they had to, because someone was always waiting in the next room, because even when the numbers were grim, doing nothing felt worse. The American West was never quiet for long. It was shaped by violence, carved out by it, fed by it, and left bleeding in the wake of it. Doctors on the frontier rarely had time to specialize. There were no war surgeons or trauma specialists. There were just men with knives and saws, pulled from sleep or pulled from dinner, sent rushing toward the wreckage of whatever horror had unfolded that day. And the horrors came often. In the wake of the Civil War, thousands of wounded soldiers returned to the frontier. Some tried to reclaim quiet lives. Others brought their wounds west with them, injuries that had never healed properly, or infections that flared up months after the battlefield had been left behind. The war had taught surgeons speed and toughness, but not precision. Amputations had been done in muddy tents. Bullets had been left inside bodies when they could not be reached. Now, years later, those injuries festered again in the dry heat of the plains or along the damp banks of rivers. Railroads brought both connection and destruction. The expansion of tracks across the West gave rise to jobs, towns, and prosperity, but also to a steady rhythm of crushed limbs and shattered skulls. The machines were massive and merciless. Men were caught beneath wheels, thrown from engines, pinned under collapsed bridges. The injuries were unlike anything doctors had seen before. Bones were splintered into powder. Flesh was torn away in great, ragged sheets. A man might arrive at the doctor's door with one arm dangling by a thread, or no face at all. The doctor could do little but cut away what remained and hope the heart held out until the bleeding stopped. Then there were the Indian Wars, a conflict that stretched across decades and left wounds on every side. The injuries were not clean. Arrows and spears made punctures that carried dirt and bone deep into the body. Bullets ripped through muscle and lodged against spine and organ. The terrain itself added insult to injury. A man could be wounded in the middle of nowhere and take days to reach the nearest outpost. By then, the wound would stink of decay. Gangrene spread up the limb like fire. If the doctor did not act immediately, the man would be dead by nightfall. Field surgery in these battles was as rudimentary as it was in any barn. A blanket laid out on the dirt, a horsehair thread pulled tight, a saw that had last been used to cut through the ribs of a Confederate corporal, now scraping down the thigh bone of a wounded scout. The tools were rarely cleaned, the wounds were rarely closed with care. An operation was successful if the man did not scream too loud or bleed out before it was done. The brutality was constant. Doctors would arrive on the scene of a skirmish or a rail accident to find bodies stacked like wood, the ground soaked and steaming. There was no time to sort the dying from the dead. They worked with hands sticky from blood, kneeling in mud, praying the patient would survive long enough to justify the pain they were about to inflict. They cut when they had to. They stitched what they could. They stuffed wounds with lint and whiskey-soaked rags. And they moved to the next man before the last one had finished groaning. The West did not offer clean lines or noble wounds. These were not the neat bullet holes shown in illustrations, the textbook cases laid out in city hospitals. These were wounds full of grit, blood, and panic. They came from train wheels and bayonets, buffalo horns, and falling scaffolds. A child might lose a hand to a dynamite blast. A man might be trampled by a runaway team of horses. There were no patterns, only chaos. And yet, people survived. Some limped their way back into town on makeshift crutches. Others learned to eat and write with their left hand when the right was gone. The frontier was full of people who bore the marks of its cruelty. Men with hollowed eyes and puckered scars. Women with stitched-up bellies from childbirths that had nearly ended them. Children with missing fingers who had once gotten too close to a saw blade. They lived, if barely, and they carried the memory of pain like a second skin. The doctors who patched them together did not always get thanks. Sometimes they were blamed when the wound reopened, or when the fever came anyway. Sometimes they were threatened, or chased out of town. But most of the time, they were just needed again, because the violence never stopped. The rails kept moving. The soldiers kept fighting. The horses kept bucking. And somewhere, always, someone was bleeding. The town of Tombstone was already halfway to legend before the name Dr. George Emery Goodfellow became part of it. Gunfighters and gamblers filled its saloons. Silver poured out of the ground and into the pockets of men with sharp eyes and quicker hands. Death came quickly in Tombstone. It walked in through swinging doors with a revolver drawn, or waited in the dust just outside town, where a man might bleed into the rocks before anyone even knew he was gone. The undertaker had more work than the schoolteacher, and in the middle of it all stood a doctor who refused to look away. Dr. Goodfellow arrived with education, but education was not what made him different. What set him apart was that he paid attention. While other doctors repeated the same bloody rituals passed down from crowded war tents and backroom apprenticeships, Goodfellow watched. He kept notes. He examined the dead. He asked questions. He studied wounds with a kind of quiet fury, determined to understand why one man lived and another did not. He saw patterns where others saw only chaos. Gunshot wounds were his specialty. Tombstone offered no shortage of those. In the first few years alone, he treated men shot in the chest, the spine, the stomach, the throat. Some crawled into his office on their own. Others were dragged there, limp and pale, their blood marking a trail across the dirt road like spilled ink. He never turned them away, and when he operated, he did it with more than instinct. He used observation. He measured, mapped, and recorded. When he found that bullets sometimes entered the body and tore through intestines without killing the patient, he did not dismiss it as luck. He explored why, and what he found would shape the understanding of trauma surgery for decades to come. He performed one of the earliest documented successful abdominal surgeries in the United States, extracting a bullet from a man's intestines without infection or death. It was unheard of at the time. Cutting into the abdomen was considered a death sentence, but Goodfellow did it carefully. He washed his hands. He cleaned his instruments with carbolic acid. He stitched the wound with silk soaked in antiseptic. He bandaged the man and waited, and the man survived. He began using irrigation to clean wounds, flushing out blood and debris with sterile solutions. He studied the effects of clothing fibers and pocket contents on the trajectory of bullets. He noticed that silk handkerchiefs worn in the breast pocket sometimes followed the bullet into the body, creating a channel that could be traced and cleaned. He wrote papers about this. His work was published in medical journals that were beginning to take note of the strange and dangerous experiments happening far away from the polished hospitals of the East. He did not stop at gunshots. When an earthquake tore through the mountains near Sonora, he rode for days to treat the injured. He braved droughts and desert heat, broken wagons and bandit-ridden roads. He performed cataract surgeries on the blind. He lanced abscesses and delivered babies. He stitched gamblers and miners, cowboys and criminals. His patients came from every corner of the frontier and every walk of life. He did not ask about reputation or cause. He asked about symptoms. He asked how long they had been hurting. Then he got to work. Goodfellow was relentless in his pursuit of better methods. While other doctors still cut with dirty blades and wiped their hands on their coats, he carried antiseptic wherever he went. He insisted on cleanliness. He insisted on logic. In a time and place where medicine was often guesswork and showmanship, he practiced with purpose. The people of Tombstone came to respect him, not because he promised miracles, but because he fought to understand what other men accepted. He was no saint. He could be sharp-tongued and impatient. He gambled. He drank. He sometimes operated in the same clothes he had worn for days. But when he stepped into a room with a patient, all of that fell away. His hands were steady. His focus was absolute. He did not waste movement or time. He worked as if the truth could be carved from flesh, as if every incision might bring him closer to something worth knowing. He stayed in Tombstone through its rise and fall, through the gunfight at the OK Corral and the slow fading of the Silver Boom. When others left, he remained, patching up the remnants of a town that had burned bright and fast. He taught younger doctors what he had learned. He left behind papers, letters, instruments worn smooth by use. And though the East was slow to listen, it eventually did. His techniques were studied, his notes dissected. The field of trauma surgery moved forward, quietly, steadily, on the back of a man who once stitched gunfighters together in a mining camp surrounded by dust and graves. Dr. George Goodfellow never called himself a pioneer. He was too busy working. But the title fits. In a world where death came without warning and medicine often made things worse, he chose to observe, to question, to change. And by doing so, he gave the Bleeding West its first glimpse of what real healing might one day look like. Pain was the constant that haunted every room where surgery was performed on the American frontier. It clung to the air like the smell of blood and alcohol, thick and suffocating, impossible to ignore. The doctors who worked in these improvised operating rooms had no illusions about what they were inflicting. They knew the patient would scream. They knew the body would buck against restraint, muscles rigid with terror. They also knew that once the first cut was made, there was no turning back. Anesthesia was not entirely absent from frontier medicine, but it was as uncertain as everything else. Chloroform and ether had been discovered decades earlier, and their use was spreading in city hospitals, where glass bottles sat neatly beside clean instruments and trained nurses kept time with ticking watches. But out in the dusty reaches of the West, these substances were rare, expensive, and badly understood. Some doctors travelled with small vials in their saddlebags, stoppered with cork and sealed with wax, hoping they would not evaporate before they were needed. Others relied on travelling salesmen to bring more, never sure of the quality or the dose. The use of chloroform was risky. A few drops on a cloth held over the mouth and nose could send a patient into unconsciousness within seconds. But it was a thin line between sleep and death. Too much, and the breathing would stop. Too little, and the patient would wake up mid-operation, thrashing in a blind panic. Ether was no better. It worked more slowly and had a sharp chemical odor that made some patients vomit even before they went under. In the wrong hands, both substances were deadly, and on the frontier, most hands were inexperienced. When anesthesia was available, the doctor administered it himself. There were no nurses to monitor breathing, no machines to measure the patient's pulse. The cloth was soaked, pressed to the face, and watched with narrowed eyes. If the chest rose and fell steadily, the doctor moved quickly. If it stilled, everything stopped. Sometimes the only way to know the patient had died was when they stopped twitching under the restraints. In places where no anesthetic could be found, whiskey stepped in. Strong, burning, and plentiful, it dulled the edges of fear and made the pain feel far away, even if just for a few minutes. Patients were handed a bottle and told to drink until they could no longer stand. Some passed out. Others slurred and mumbled through the entire procedure, eyes wide and glazed. The truly unfortunate stayed conscious through every second, biting down on leather straps or wooden spoons, their cries echoing off the walls. The rooms where these surgeries took place were as brutal as the procedures themselves. There were no standard setups. Doctors worked where they could, with what they had. Sometimes it was a kitchen table scrubbed with a handful of lye soap. Sometimes it was a bar counter cleared of glasses and dusted with sawdust. The patient lay on blankets or sacks of grain, whatever could be found. Light came from lanterns, candles, or open windows. In summer, the flies were relentless. In winter, the cold turned blood to sludge and stiffened the doctor's fingers. Assistants were rarely trained. They were farmers, barkeepers, or teenage boys asked to hold a limb steady or pass a knife. Instructions were shouted mid-cut. Hands slipped. Tools dropped to the floor. The doctor cursed and kept going. There was no time for delicacy. The room was full of tension, of sweat and heat, and the unmistakable scent of human fear. The people watching were often family. A wife holding her husband's hand while it was being taken. A child weeping in the corner while the doctor worked on their father's chest. There was no privacy, no curtains, no barrier between the living and the half-dead. Afterwards, the mess was left to be cleaned by whoever could stomach it. Buckets of blood-soaked water were tossed outside. Instruments were rinsed in whatever was handy: pond water, whiskey, spit. Bandages were torn from old sheets and tied as tight as possible. The doctor gave a few quiet instructions, sometimes stayed to monitor the first few hours, and then moved on to the next patient, the next wound, the next desperate town. The men and women who endured these surgeries were changed forever. Some walked away with missing limbs and hollow stares, grateful to be alive, even if life would never feel the same. Others never recovered, drifting into fever or madness, their bodies too broken to heal. A few died days later from infections no one could name or stop. And yet they kept coming. People knocked on the doctor's door, carried their bleeding loved ones across deserts and prairies, clung to the hope that pain could be cut out like a tumor and left behind in a wash basin. The makeshift surgeries of the West were acts of courage and desperation, theatre and brutality. They were performed under lanterns, surrounded by dust and grief, by people who knew they might fail and did it anyway. And every time a patient survived, every time a limb was removed cleanly, or a wound stitched shut with trembling hands, it felt like a small kind of miracle. Even if the room stank of death, even if the screams echoed long after the doctor was gone, even if pain ruled every moment of recovery, those few seconds between cutting and survival meant everything. And in the West, that was enough. The virus did not ride in on horseback or slip through the cracks of a broken window. It came with the riverboats, with the trains, with the travelers wrapped in thick wool coats, who disembarked in bustling frontier towns and left something behind without ever knowing it. Smallpox did not announce itself. It settled into lungs, crept under the skin, and waited. And once it took hold, it spread like fire across the dry grasses of the American West, unstoppable and indifferent. In 1837, one steamboat, the St. Peter, anchored near Fort Clark in present-day North Dakota, carrying furs and passengers and a hidden plague. The traders came ashore smiling, shaking hands, exchanging goods. A single infected man, coughing quietly in the cabin, unleashed a catastrophe. Within days, the Mandan people began to fall ill. The fever came first. Then the pustules, angry, red, and weeping, bloomed across their faces, chests, and limbs. The elders, the children, the warriors, the women who had just given birth, none were spared. By the end of the summer, 9 out of every 10 Mandan were dead. Entire families vanished. Villages fell silent. And the virus moved on. It traveled west and north, carried by traders and soldiers, hidden in the clothes of the dead, tucked inside blankets gifted in good faith or malicious indifference. The Arikara, the Assiniboine, the Blackfeet, the Sioux, all of them were struck in waves. There was no time to bury the bodies properly. Some were burned where they lay. Others were left for the wind and the scavengers. Survivors wandered through empty camps, dazed and alone, the stench of rot clinging to their clothes. And always the virus kept moving, immune to borders, immune to prayer. The devastation was swift because the body had no memory of the disease. Smallpox was new to these people, but it was ancient in the world. In Europe, it had been killing for centuries, giving rise to quarantines and variolation, to rudimentary vaccines passed between doctors like secrets. But those resources were scarce on the frontier, and they were almost entirely absent in the lands inhabited by indigenous nations. There were no hospitals here, no doctors travelling upriver with coolers full of inoculations. There were only traders and soldiers, missionaries and officials, and few of them had the tools or the will to prevent what was coming. The government saw the danger, but responded slowly. Some officials tried to send vaccine kits upriver, crude wooden boxes containing threads soaked in cowpox to be scratched into the arms of the healthy. These kits arrived late. Some never arrived at all. Others were delivered to forts where no one could read the instructions. Tribal leaders asked for help. Some were promised vials that never came. Others received doses too diluted to offer protection. In some cases, the vaccines were hoarded by army surgeons for soldiers and their families, passed out like favors instead of given where the outbreak raged strongest. Rumors spread through the camps like the virus itself. Some said the blankets were cursed. Some said the disease had been sent on purpose, a white man's weapon. There were stories of contaminated goods, of treaties broken through sickness, of men who knew what they carried and handed it over anyway. And while not every tale was true, the timing could not be ignored. The virus always followed contact. It arrived with trade and treaties. It came with flags and gifts, and once it arrived, it consumed. Indigenous medicine men did what they could. They gathered herbs, burned cedar, sang through the night, but their traditions had no cure for smallpox. The healers fell alongside the warriors. The knowledge passed from one generation to the next began to fracture under the weight of so much death. Some tribes lost entire lineages of midwives, storytellers, dancers, and leaders. Elders who held decades of memory slipped into fever dreams and did not return. The aftermath was more than physical. It was cultural erasure by disease. Entire languages lost their last speakers. Sacred practices went unperformed for the first time in living memory. Burial rites were shortened or abandoned altogether. Some survivors turned to Christianity out of desperation. Others turned away from everything. The grief was too wide, the silence too heavy. And yet, despite the scale of the loss, the epidemic was barely mentioned in most frontier newspapers. Reports focused on settlements, on railroads, on treaties and gold. The suffering of indigenous nations was footnoted, treated as an unfortunate consequence of progress, a distant thing, a sad inevitability. But for those who lived through it, or whose ancestors died in the long summer of 1837 and the years that followed, it was not distant. It was the wound that never closed. It was the fire that burned through the heart of their world and left ash behind. Smallpox did not destroy all of them, but it tried. And the fact that any stories remain at all, passed down in songs and whispers, is a testament to something stronger than the disease. Something that refused to vanish, even as the steamers kept arriving, even as the virus returned in new forms, even as the world around them changed shape. The survivors buried their dead, tended to the sick, and endured. And in doing so, they carried forward the memory of what had been lost and the warning of what had been unleashed. In the world of disease, timing is everything. A single day can mark the difference between prevention and catastrophe, between a fever that breaks and a grave that is filled. On the frontier, that difference often came down to who had the medicine and who was left waiting. As smallpox spread through the West, the vaccine existed. The knowledge existed. The means to stop the suffering were there. But somewhere between the promise and the delivery, the system broke. And when it broke along the lines of power. The smallpox vaccine was a crude thing by modern standards, but it worked. Developed decades earlier in Europe, it relied on material taken from cowpox lesions, milder and far less deadly, to give the human body a fighting chance. The vaccine could be transported in small wooden cases, often using threads or quills soaked in lymph, then scratched into the skin of the recipient. If administered correctly, it provided protection. If it arrived too late or in the wrong condition, it did nothing. The procedure was simple. The logistics were not. The government had the ability to distribute these vaccines across the frontier. They had ships, forts, mail routes, and field agents. But distribution was inconsistent. Some areas received supplies in a timely manner. Others were ignored for months, even years. Indigenous communities were often placed at the bottom of the list, despite being among the most vulnerable. Some officials viewed the tribes as temporary populations, as obstacles to expansion rather than human lives to be protected. Others simply lacked the infrastructure or the will to follow through. Promises were made in meetings. Vials were packed and shipped, but the threads arrived dry. The boxes were broken. The instructions, when included, were often written in languages no one in the camp could read. A surgeon at Fort Union wrote in frustration that he was ordered to vaccinate the garrison's soldiers, but not the nearby Assiniboine community, even as he watched the disease cut through their village with terrifying speed. He vaccinated them anyway, against orders. But such acts of defiance were rare. The reasons for denial varied. Some were bureaucratic, some were born from prejudice. In a few dark cases, denial seemed intentional. There were whispers that withholding the vaccine might be used as a tool of control, a way to weaken resistance or hasten removal. No official policy ever declared this, but the pattern was hard to ignore. The vaccine reached white settlements more consistently than it reached tribal lands. When disease struck both, aid flowed in one direction, while the other was left to suffer in silence. Even when the vaccine was granted, it came with challenges. It required refrigeration that did not exist, clean needles that were hard to come by, and people who knew how to administer it without introducing new infections. In the chaos of the frontier, those conditions were rarely met. Some well-meaning missionaries and settlers tried to deliver vaccines on their own, often without proper training. A botched vaccination could lead to infection, scarring, or a false sense of protection. There were cases where entire villages were told they were safe, only to be hit by smallpox weeks later. Confidence in the treatment faltered. Mistrust took root. It did not help that earlier generations had already been exposed to betrayal. Stories of poisoned blankets, given under the pretense of friendship, had passed from one tongue to the next. The vaccine, when it did come, looked like another gift from the same hand. Some tribes embraced it, desperate to protect their people. Others hesitated. They had seen what white medicine brought. They had watched children fall ill after a stranger touched their skin. They had no reason to believe that this thread, this scratch on the arm, would save them instead of curse them. The truth is that the vaccine could have saved thousands. It had the power to protect the very communities that were hit hardest. But protection was never just about medicine. It was about policy. It was about priority. And in the hierarchy of the American frontier, indigenous lives were rarely placed at the center of concern. They were considered subjects, obstacles, names on a map, sometimes even enemies. Rarely were they treated as people with the right to survive. Some tribal communities took matters into their own hands. They built quarantine camps. They isolated the sick. They learned what they could from observation, trial, and heartbreaking error. Elders passed down new protocols for dealing with outbreaks. They created their own systems, their own methods, in the absence of help. These efforts were remarkable. They were also incomplete. Disease does not wait for systems to catch up. It spreads, devours, and leaves behind stories written in ash. The vaccine was a turning point in the story of smallpox. But on the frontier, it was a turning point that came too late for many. Not because it did not work, but because it was not shared equally. It sat in glass bottles on shelves hundreds of miles away, while entire villages burned their dead and waited for relief that never came. The science was there, the humanity was not, and history would not forget it. The sickness did not just take lives, it unraveled worlds. When smallpox swept through the villages of the plains, the forests, the river valleys, it did not stop at the body. It reached into the deepest roots of culture, tearing away everything that gave a people their sense of place. It came in waves, sometimes years apart, sometimes so closely spaced that communities had no time to recover. The first wave took the elders, the second wave took the children. What remained after that was a quiet no one had words for. Entire nations were reduced to scattered bands. Some groups that had once counted thousands of members could barely muster a few dozen after the worst outbreaks passed. The dead were not just warriors or mothers or infants. They were language keepers, ceremonial dancers, medicine carriers, storytellers. They were the ones who remembered the old migrations, who knew the stars, who could identify every root in the forest and knew what it could cure. Their knowledge had been carried in memory, spoken aloud, passed from voice to voice. When their breath stopped, the memory broke. The demographics collapsed in a way that made rebuilding nearly impossible. With so many elders gone, there was no one to perform naming ceremonies or initiation rites. Without young men, hunting parties shrank. Without women of childbearing age, the next generation never came. There were too few hands to build new lodges, too few bodies to defend territory. Some tribes combined with others for survival, dissolving once distinct identities into something new, born from necessity and loss. Funerals became shorter. The old songs, once sung for days, were reduced to minutes. There were simply too many dead. The grief never had time to complete its shape before the next body was wrapped. Some communities burned their villages and moved, hoping the fire would cleanse the air. Others left offerings in the trees and fled to the hills, seeking isolation. But the sickness always found them. It moved through rivers and trade routes. It came with the wind. It seemed unstoppable and cruel. For many, the traditional beliefs began to falter under the weight of the losses. If the spirits were watching, why did they not intervene? Why did they allow the children to die before they could even speak? In some places, people turned to Christian missionaries, not out of faith, but because the missionaries had bread and medicine and the promise of something different. Churches were built where sweat lodges once stood. The old ways were renamed superstition, and yet, in secret, the stories were still told, whispered beneath blankets at night, too sacred to say aloud in the open, but too precious to let go. The social structures fractured as quickly as the population. Leaders died without naming successors. Councils vanished. Decision-making became a frantic, temporary thing, focused on survival rather than wisdom. The concept of time itself shifted. Life was no longer marked by seasons or ceremonies. It was measured by outbreaks, before the sickness, after the sickness. That was how time passed now. That was how stories were told. Colonial governments seized the moment. Treaties were signed under pressure, sometimes with surviving representatives who had no authority to speak for the rest. Land was given up, not because it was fair or just, but because there were no people left to defend it. Maps were redrawn in ink, while blood was still drying on the ground. The silence left by the dead became a kind of invitation for settlers to move in, to build fences where footpaths had once curved through open plains. Some tribes tried to regroup. They held on to their remaining traditions with quiet desperation. A few elders, spared by chance or by sheer will, gathered the children who were left and began again. They retold the origin stories. They taught the dances. They pressed language into young minds like seeds into dry soil, hoping something would grow in the shadow of so much death. But they were always aware of how much had already been lost. Some things had no one left to remember them. Disease did not just kill, it erased. And what it did not erase, it weakened until the shape of a people was warped into something unrecognizable. The names of clans were forgotten, the reasons for rituals blurred, songs lost verses. Words disappeared from the language. Traditions that had survived for generations collapsed in the space of a few months, swept away by invisible microbes carried in the breath of strangers. It was a kind of conquest no bullet could achieve, and it left scars deeper than any battlefield. Still, the survivors endured. They rebuilt with what they had. They stitched together their histories from the fragments that remained. They buried the dead with hands that trembled but did not stop. They taught their children to listen, even if the old stories came with gaps. They planted corn in the same soil that had once soaked up blood. And they remembered. They remembered not just the horror, but the resilience. The way people had gathered together, even in the face of disease, to sing, to grieve, to hold one another upright when the world fell apart. What was taken cannot be replaced, but what survived, what was carried forward despite the silence, is what still lives today. A story told in a reclaimed language, a dance performed after 100 years of stillness, a prayer whispered in the same mountains where the fever once burned. It is not enough to undo the loss, but it is enough to say they were never erased completely. They were here, they endured, and they are still telling their story. Long before the doctors arrived on horseback with their stained satchels and dull scalpels, women were already healing. On the frontier, in settlements carved out between pine and prairie, it was the midwives and medicine women who delivered the babies, stopped the bleeding, calmed the fevers, and sat with the dying. They worked quietly, mostly without titles, often without formal recognition. But their presence was constant, woven into the rhythm of daily life like the rising sun and the smell of cooking fires. They did not carry certificates or instruments made of polished steel. What they carried was experience, passed down from mothers, grandmothers, and elders who had seen everything from breech births to epidemics to long, slow deaths that dragged on through the coldest winters. Frontier women could not afford to be helpless. They learned out of necessity. A mother needed to know how to stop a hemorrhage if her daughter went into labor miles from the nearest town. A wife needed to know how to soothe a fever with willow bark or mustard poultices. These women learned to recognize the signs of complications, to measure the space between contractions, to judge by eye whether the afterbirth had come clean. They did all of this in kitchens, in barns, and in cabins that rattled in the wind. They wrapped newborns in old quilts and wiped blood from the floor with aprons already streaked with dirt. They did not flinch. They had no time for fear. Among indigenous communities, healing was inseparable from the natural world. Medicine women gathered herbs with ritual and purpose, knowing which roots to dig and which flowers to leave untouched. They treated illness as something spiritual and physical, a disharmony that could be soothed with both hands and ceremony. They used smoke and song, salves made from crushed berries and animal fat, teas brewed from bark and bitter leaves. The forest and plains were their pharmacy, the body their map. Their knowledge was precise, inherited across generations through practice rather than books. When settlers came, many dismissed these methods as superstition, but the truth was that more than one white family owed its survival to a midwife or healer who spoke little English but knew exactly what to do when the baby turned sideways in the womb or when the winter cough turned wet and heavy. As formal medicine slowly pushed westward, it did not come to learn from these women. It came to replace them. Male doctors, often with limited training themselves, began to look at midwives as outdated and dangerous. Medical journals written far from the frontier warned against female practitioners, calling them unscientific and unsanitary. Laws were passed that limited their work or required licenses they could not afford. Hospitals began to appear in towns, and with them came the idea that birth and illness belonged inside buildings, under the care of professionals who wore coats and used Latin words. But people remembered. They remembered who had shown up when the doctor was still a day's ride away. They remembered whose hands had caught their children, whose voice had guided them through the long hours of pain, whose knowledge had turned fever aside when there was nothing else to try. And so the midwives kept working, quietly, carefully, in the shadows of a medical system that did not recognize their worth, but could not truly replace them. These women, whether white, black, or indigenous, were often the only line of defense between life and death. They knew the terrain of the body in a way the textbooks never could. They worked without fanfare and often without pay. And still, they showed up again and again when someone called for help. Their legacy lives not in monuments or museum exhibits, but in the stories passed down. Stories told by families who remember that when the worst came, it was a woman with steady hands and a bag of herbs who stood beside them and did what needed to be done. By the mid-19th century, a quiet rebellion was brewing beneath the surface of American medicine. It took root in places the East Coast elites rarely looked. Small towns, rural counties, and frontier settlements where suffering was common and results mattered more than theories. It was a movement of frustration and practicality, led by people who had grown tired of watching patients drained by bleeding or poisoned by calomel, a mercury compound that ate at the gums and blackened the teeth. These rebels were called eclectic physicians, and what they offered was simple: care grounded in observation, in plants, in logic, and in the idea that the human body might heal if given the right support instead of being broken down further. Eclectic medicine borrowed from many sources. It took cues from indigenous herbal traditions, from European botany, and from folk healing passed between enslaved people, immigrants, and rural families. It valued experience over hierarchy, results over dogma. While traditional physicians scoffed at the use of golden seal, lobelia, and black cohosh, the eclectics kept using them because they worked. They paid attention to which plants calmed spasms, which teas brought down fevers, which roots eased the sharp pains of childbirth or digestion. They kept notebooks filled with details, doses, reactions, combinations. They watched, they adjusted, they learned. The first official school of eclectic medicine opened in Cincinnati, Ohio in the 1830s. It was founded in defiance of the medical establishment, and its students came from backgrounds as diverse as their approaches. Some were farmers, Some had worked as apprentices in rural towns. Some were former midwives or self-taught healers looking for legitimacy. They did not believe medicine should be exclusive or mysterious. They believed it should be useful. And so they built their curriculum around botanical studies, anatomy, diagnosis by observation, and above all, doing no harm. Eclectics gained a foothold in the West for one simple reason: they were effective. In towns where the standard medical options were limited to bloodletting, opium, or doing nothing at all, the arrival of an eclectic physician with jars of tinctures and a pocket full of dried herbs offered real hope. They were often more affordable than mainstream doctors. They were more likely to treat women with respect. They listened, they explained. And when people got better, word spread. The American Medical Association, established in the 1840s, hated them. It labeled them quacks and fought to limit their influence through licensing laws, smear campaigns, and exclusion from hospitals. But the people kept coming. Eclectics established their own institutions, published their own journals, and built communities of practice that stretched from New England to the farthest western frontier. In many cases, they worked side by side with midwives, creating a model of care that was deeply local, rooted in shared values and shared struggles. The rise of eclectic medicine did not last forever. By the early 20th century, with the consolidation of medical licensing boards and the growing influence of pharmaceutical companies, most eclectic schools were closed or absorbed into more conventional institutions. Their texts were archived, their methods labeled outdated, their contributions faded from mainstream memory. But in the dust of frontier towns, where names were scratched into wooden grave markers and stories passed around fires, the memory of those doctors lingered. They were the ones who came when no one else would. The ones who treated the whole person, not just the symptom. The ones who trusted in the wisdom of plants and people alike. They were called eclectic, a word that meant they took what worked and left the rest behind. In the chaos of a brutal landscape, that choice made all the difference. There were moments, quiet ones, tucked between the chaos and dust, where something unexpected happened. A wound that had festered for days began to heal. A fever broke in the middle of the night. A child who had been wheezing for days finally took a deep, full breath. And when the families gathered around, exhausted but relieved, it was not always a man in a coat with a bag of metal instruments who had made it possible. Sometimes it was a bundle of dried leaves soaked in boiling water. Sometimes it was a poultice wrapped in cloth and pressed gently against the skin. Sometimes it was a voice that knew how to soothe, a hand that had delivered dozens of babies, a knowledge that came from years of watching, trying, failing, and trying again. These were the successful alternatives, the ones dismissed by the official schools but remembered in kitchens and passed down like heirlooms. Botanical remedies were not used because people were naive. They were used because they worked. In a world without pharmacies, without reliable doctors or clean hospitals, the plants growing nearby became lifelines. Willow bark, which contained a chemical similar to modern aspirin, was chewed to reduce pain and fever. Yarrow was crushed and applied to wounds to stop bleeding. Slippery elm bark soothed sore throats and stomach ulcers. Golden seal, sometimes called the frontier's antibiotic, was used to treat infections long before people knew what bacteria were. Women used raspberry leaf to ease childbirth. Men used echinacea to fight infection. Children were given licorice root for coughs. These treatments were not miracles. They did not save everyone. but they helped. And in the daily battle to stay alive, sometimes help was enough. These remedies were used by everyone: white settlers, indigenous families, black homesteaders, Chinese immigrants. They all brought their own traditions, their own formulas and mixtures and beliefs. And over time, those remedies blended. A Cherokee woman might trade with an Irish widow for dried comfrey root. A German midwife might learn from a Lakota healer which berries were safe to use in childbirth and which would bring on labor too early. These exchanges were not formal. They were born of shared experience and desperation. They happened in whispers, over campfires and fence rails, and they became part of the fabric of survival. Eclectic physicians thrived in this environment. Unlike the rigid doctors trained in distant universities, eclectics listened. They wrote down recipes that had been passed through families. They tested herbs on themselves before giving them to patients. They were careful, methodical, and deeply pragmatic. If something worked, they used it. If it failed, they tried something else. They were less concerned with theory than with outcomes. A man who could walk again after being given a tincture of skullcap and valerian did not care that the treatment had no Latin name. He cared that it worked. And for many on the frontier, that was what mattered most. There were also midwives who straddled both worlds. Some carried herbs in their aprons and used chants handed down through generations. Others had studied with eclectic doctors or read books sent by distant cousins in the city. They combined science and tradition in a way that was fluid and adaptable. They treated patients in back rooms, on porches, beside riverbanks. They learned to recognize the line between a normal fever and a deadly one, the difference between a slow labor and a dangerous one. Their success came not from miracle cures, but from a deep and practiced understanding of the body. They observed, they remembered, they adapted. These alternatives gained quiet reputations. In some towns, word spread about a woman who could stop seizures with drops of oil, or a man who had cured dysentery with a bitter tea. Neighbors would knock on doors and ask careful questions. Recipes were scribbled on scraps of paper and stuffed in drawers, folded between pages of Bibles, tucked inside sewing kits. People were careful not to speak too loudly. The growing medical establishment viewed these methods as primitive and dangerous, but people remembered what worked. The success of these treatments did not mean the frontier was free of tragedy. People still died. Children still wasted away from illness. Mothers still bled out during childbirth. But when survival came, it often came from these quiet corners, from the people and practices deemed unofficial and unsanctioned. The frontier was not kind. It devoured the unprepared, but in its shadow, women and men who were never invited into the official halls of medicine built something real. They saved lives. They preserved knowledge. They proved again and again that healing did not belong solely to those with degrees. In time, these practices would be pushed aside. Regulations would tighten. Medical boards would outlaw midwifery in some states. Herbalists would be labeled quacks. Eclectic schools would close. But the memory of their success never fully vanished. It lived in stories. It lived in remedies still made at kitchen tables. It lived in the stubborn belief, passed from one generation to the next, that sometimes the simplest answer is the right one. And that healing is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet and steady and made from roots pulled from the earth with bare hands. They arrived like preachers and performed like actors, men in clean suits with waxed moustaches and gold rings, standing on crates at the edge of a crowd with a bottle in one hand and a story in the other. Some came by wagon, others by rail. They set up in the center of town, outside the saloon, in front of the general store, or anywhere that dust and desperation gathered. Their voices rang out over the clamor of livestock and the creak of wagon wheels, promising miracles to the tired and the poor. To the farmer whose joints ached in the morning, to the mother whose child coughed all night, to the miner whose blood came up red when he spat into the dirt. There was no ailment too great, no suffering too small. There was a cure for everything, and it came in a bottle that cost less than a good pair of boots. The labels were bright and confident. Golden ink stamped across parchment paper, printed with names like Dr. Williams's Indian blood syrup, or Professor Baxter's fever and ague remover. The ingredients, if listed at all, were cloaked in mystery. A secret blend of herbs, a proprietary formula known only to the most educated medical minds of the century. And if a person dared to ask what was really inside the bottle, they were met with a knowing smile and a story about science that sounded just plausible enough to believe. Most of the time, the buyers did not ask. They were too tired, too frightened, too familiar with the sting of disappointment. They bought the bottles because they wanted them to work. They needed them to work. They drank the contents slowly or quickly, depending on the urgency of the symptoms, and waited for the promise to come true. The truth behind those promises was less noble. Many of the so-called medicines were little more than alcohol mixed with flavoring. Some added opium to quiet pain or nerves. Others laced their formulas with cocaine, a stimulant that created a feeling of health while grinding the body down in silence. Still others used turpentine, camphor, or morphine, substances that numbed, intoxicated, and confused, but did not cure. The effects were immediate and often dramatic. A child who had not slept in days fell into a deep and sudden rest. A man with shaking hands steadied his grip and declared himself renewed, but the relief was temporary, and the price was high. Addiction took root before most even knew the word for it. A mother who had given her child a soothing syrup began taking it herself, just to get through the day. A farmhand who drank a tonic for his nerves found he could not start his chores without it. Over time, the doses grew larger. The bottles emptied faster, and the symptoms they were trying to cure returned with greater force. But no one blamed the medicine. Not yet. Instead, they blamed the disease, the weather, bad luck, or the body itself. The sellers had done their job too well. They had built their pitch on charm, repetition, and spectacle. By the time anyone noticed the harm, the wagon was gone, and the seller had moved on to the next town. Quackery, as the more educated physicians called it, became a war fought not with weapons, but with words and influence. Legitimate doctors wrote editorials in small-town newspapers warning against fraudulent cures. Medical journals published exposés, dissecting the formulas of popular tonics and revealing the poisons inside. But it was difficult to compete with the spectacle. A doctor working out of a plain office could not draw a crowd the way a medicine show could. He did not travel with a brass band or bring a dancing bear. He did not offer the audience a free sample or cure someone in real time on a makeshift stage. He simply sat behind a desk and gave sober advice, which, compared to a bottle that promised to fix everything, often felt like not much at all. Some of the medicine men believed their own sales pitch. They had been told the formula by someone they trusted, or they had read a pamphlet printed by a company in Chicago and taken it as gospel. They had watched people drink their potion and seem to get better, and that was enough to convince them they were helping. Others knew exactly what they were doing. They kept their pockets lined with profits while customers lined up with trembling hands. When someone died, it was chalked up to timing or the severity of the illness. When someone lived, it was hailed as proof that the medicine worked. Eventually, the government began to notice. Complaints reached Washington. Dead children, ruined minds, addiction that left men unable to work or speak. But regulation was slow and enforcement slower. The country was vast, the records incomplete, and the demand for relief stronger than ever. Even as the federal government debated legislation, the bottles kept being filled. Factories in New York and St. Louis shipped out crates labeled with new names and new promises. The labels changed faster than the law could catch them. It would take decades for meaningful reform to arrive. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was still far in the future during the worst of the frontier years. Until then, the people of the West lived in a world where medicine was whatever the loudest voice said it was, where a bottle could be a cure or a curse, and no one could tell the difference until it was too late. The damage was deep, but it was hard to measure. Lives lost to addiction rarely made the history books. Families broken by dependence did not appear in the census. Yet the legacy of those fraudulent cures lingered long after the bottles were gone. It lingered in the empty cupboards where the money had gone, in the trembling hands of widows left behind, in the grave markers carved too soon. Still, people kept buying. They wanted to believe in the easy fix, the magic bottle, the sweet-tasting answer to pain. In a world where survival required sacrifice and most cures came wrapped in agony, the quick one felt like mercy. And that was the secret. The sellers did not need to lie. They only needed to give people something to hope for, even if that hope was a poison dressed as a promise, even if it ended with silence. There was a moment, just before the blade touched skin, when everything in the room went still. The patients stared at the ceiling or closed their eyes, sometimes whispering a prayer, sometimes crying without sound. The doctor took a breath. The assistants held their grip. The air hung thick with the smell of sweat and alcohol. And then the cutting began. Before anesthesia, this was the moment everyone dreaded most. It was the space between hope and horror, the instant where the body became a battlefield and pain rushed in like a flood. In the earliest days of frontier surgery, there was no real buffer between the patient and the agony. Whiskey numbed the edges for some. Others bit down on leather straps or wooden spoons. A few were lucky enough to pass out from fear before the first incision. But most remained awake, fully aware, locked inside bodies they could not escape. They screamed, they thrashed, they begged. It was not weakness, it was biology. The body knew when it was being torn apart, and it responded with every ounce of force it could muster. The discovery of chemical anesthesia changed everything, but change did not come quickly to the West. In the cities, doctors were already experimenting with ether and chloroform. They were learning how to dose a patient, how to watch the rise and fall of the chest, how to calculate just enough to send them under without sending them away for good. But the frontier lagged behind. Anesthesia required access, precision, and knowledge, all things in short supply where the roads were made of dirt, and the nearest doctor might be days away. Still, it came. Bit by bit, bottle by bottle, it arrived in the saddlebags of ambitious surgeons, or the trunks of traveling pharmacists. At first, it was treated like another miracle cure. a mysterious substance that could render a man unconscious in seconds. The early trials were uneven. A few drops too few, and the patient would wake mid-procedure, screaming and clawing at the table. A few drops too many, and the chest would still, the lips would turn blue, and nothing could be done. There were no monitors, no guidelines, no second chances. Anesthesia was a risk taken in faith, and the faith did not always hold. Ether was more common in the early years. It had a pungent smell that clung to everything it touched. Doctors would soak a cloth, press it over the patient's face, and wait. Sometimes the patient panicked, trying to pull the cloth away. Sometimes they vomited, choking on their own fear. But when it worked with shocking efficiency. A body that would have trembled and screamed now lay limp. The surgeon could cut, sew, explore. For the first time, it was possible to take time with a procedure, to do more than rush through it. It was possible to think. Chloroform followed, a quieter agent, more potent in smaller doses. It came with its own dangers. It was harder to control, easier to overdose. There were cases where it stopped the heart within seconds. Young women seemed particularly vulnerable, collapsing into unconsciousness from the first breath and never rising again. Still, doctors used it. They used it because they had seen what surgery looked like without it, and they knew which version they preferred. The trade-off felt worth it. Not everyone trusted these new tools. Some saw anesthesia as a form of indulgence, a way of softening people who needed to be strong. There were surgeons who still believed that pain had value, that it helped the body fight, that it kept the soul engaged. Others distrusted the science. They had seen too many patients die after the cloth was pressed to their face. Better, they said, to hear a man scream and know he was alive than to silence him and risk losing him in silence. It was a brutal logic, but not entirely unfounded. The margin between sleep and death was razor thin. Then there were those who feared the spiritual consequences. Some believed that unconsciousness opened the soul to corruption, that a person who went under might return different, possessed, broken. These ideas had roots in religion, in folklore, in the unexplainable things that happened in candlelit rooms where men woke screaming after long, silent surgeries. Anesthesia was treated with a kind of reverence and fear, a substance as dangerous as the diseases it was meant to ease. Despite the fear, its use grew. Word spread. Doctors who had once dismissed it now asked for demonstrations. Midwives experimented with small doses during complicated births. Dentists began using it to extract teeth without tears. Families whispered about it with cautious hope. The first time someone saw their father go to sleep beneath a cloth and wake without pain, it felt like magic. And in a world where so much of healing was guesswork and grit, magic had its place. The presence of anesthesia changed surgery. It allowed doctors to attempt things that would have been impossible otherwise. Tumors were removed. Bones were set with precision instead of force. Internal injuries could be explored instead of ignored. It created the illusion of control, even when outcomes remained uncertain. And as doctors learned to use it, they also learned to watch for signs. The flicker of the eyelids, the color of the lips, the rhythm of the breath. They began to understand the body not as something to be endured, but as something to be studied and protected. Still, the dangers never fully vanished. Supplies were inconsistent. Some bottles were diluted. Others had been exposed to heat or air and lost their potency. In remote areas, doctors reused the same cloth again and again, unaware of the infections they were spreading. And always, there was the question of dosage. Each patient responded differently. Each moment carried its own risks. There were no formulas carved in stone, only instincts shaped by trial and error. But for all its flaws, anesthesia was a turning point. It marked the beginning of a new kind of medicine on the frontier, one that dared to imagine a world where pain could be eased and suffering minimized. It did not erase the brutality of surgery, but it softened its edge. It gave doctors a tool that offered time, and in that time, they began to learn more. They stitched cleaner lines. They closed wounds with care. They stopped reaching for the sore the moment something looked wrong. They paused, and in that pause, something revolutionary began to grow. The frontier was still wild, still cruel, still soaked in dust and blood. But the cloth, soaked in ether, pressed gently over a patient's face, was a sign that the tide was turning, that maybe medicine did not have to be a choice between agony and death, that maybe, just maybe, there was a third way, a quieter way, a way worth fighting for. The dead did not rest easily in the 19th century. Beneath the soil of newly dug graves, in the quiet corners of cemeteries guarded by crooked fences and fading crosses, bodies were pulled from the earth under cover of night. They were not taken by enemies or wild animals. They were taken by students, by doctors, by young men with muddy boots and shaking hands, tasked with a job they despised but accepted all the same. To learn how to save the living, they needed to study the dead. And out west, where formal medical schools were scarce and human cadavers even scarcer, the only way to learn was to steal what no one would give. The study of human anatomy had always lived in a grey space, balanced between science and something darker. Dissection was necessary. The body had to be opened, explored, measured, sketched. But laws surrounding cadaver use were uneven and unclear. In some states, only executed criminals could be dissected, their punishment extending beyond the gallows into the sterile rooms of teaching hospitals. In others, the law made no provision at all, and where the law was silent, demand rose like a fever. Medical schools in the East had already begun to establish networks of body suppliers, men who dug in cemeteries and delivered the dead to anatomy professors for a price. These suppliers were often poor, sometimes criminals, always quiet. They operated in shadows, removing fresh bodies before morning, selling them by weight or condition. In the frontier towns, where medical training was more improvisational and bodies were buried in simple pine boxes under thin layers of earth, the temptation was even greater. There were fewer eyes, fewer questions, and a growing hunger for knowledge. Young doctors, often apprenticing under more experienced physicians, knew they had to learn the body by seeing it firsthand. They needed to hold the organs, to understand how the bones fit together, to trace the path of veins with their fingers. No book could replace the experience of slicing open a chest or pulling back the skin to find the tendons beneath. But corpses were not given freely. Families wanted to mourn. Communities saw the dead as sacred. Grave robbing was seen as the ultimate violation, and so it was done in secret. There were strategies. Newly buried graves were the easiest to disturb, the soil still soft and loose. A team would wait until the moon was high and the town was asleep. They worked quickly, digging just enough to reach the upper half of the coffin. The lid was pried open. A rope was tied under the arms of the corpse. And with gritted teeth and careful coordination, they pulled the body up, stripped it of any clothing or jewelry, and covered the grave as best they could. Sometimes they took only the torso. Sometimes they left the head, if they were in too much of a rush. What mattered was the anatomy. The rest was discarded without ceremony. Word spread fast when a grave had been disturbed. Families returned to find the soil uneven, the markers tilted, the casket lid askew. There was no greater outrage. Mobs formed. Doctors were confronted in their offices. Medical students were chased from towns. In one Kansas settlement, a physician's clinic was burned to the ground after it was discovered that he had been dissecting the body of a recently buried teenager. In another, a medical apprentice was nearly lynched before being locked in a storage shed and escorted out of town the next morning. Communities treated grave robbing as more than a crime. It was a betrayal, a desecration, proof that doctors saw people as parts, not as souls. And yet, the work continued, because the need did not go away. Frontier doctors were expected to treat every injury and illness with a confidence that required more than theory. They were expected to cut into living bodies, and to do that, they had to understand what waited beneath the skin. The tension between this need and the public horror at dissection created a war of silence. Bodies were studied behind locked doors. Conversations were hushed. Students dissected in barns, in sheds, in the basements of schoolhouses. In winter, they stored cadavers in snowbanks to keep them from rotting too quickly. In summer, they worked fast, windows open, flies swarming. The stench was overwhelming, but they kept going. Over time, reform efforts emerged. Medical schools petitioned state legislatures for legal access to unclaimed bodies, to prevent the need for grave robbing. Some cities began to pass anatomy acts, laws that allowed public hospitals and almshouses to donate unclaimed corpses to science. These laws were controversial. Critics called them heartless. But to doctors, they were a lifeline, a way to learn without breaking the law or desecrating the dead. Slowly, dissection began to move out of the shadows and into structured learning environments. Still, on the frontier, reform was slow to arrive. Laws passed in the East rarely made it west intact. Medical students there continued to rely on the old ways. They dug, they hid, they dissected in secret, and they bore the consequences. Some were caught and jailed, others were chased out of practice altogether. The anatomy wars were not just about medicine. They were about the boundary between science and society, between curiosity and respect, between the need to know and the right to grieve. In the end, dissection became a part of standard medical training. It became expected, formalized, regulated. But the cost of getting there was steep. For years, doctors walked a line between legality and survival, between learning and violating, between the living and the dead. And in their quest to understand the body, they left behind a trail of disturbed graves and broken trust. The bones they studied were silent, but the towns they left behind remembered the sound of shovels digging into fresh earth. They remembered who had vanished in the night, and who had dared to learn what others were too afraid to see. By the end of the 19th century, the tide was turning. It did not happen all at once. There was no single law passed, no great discovery announced in every newspaper. It happened slowly, in pieces, like sunlight creeping into a dark room. The horrors of frontier medicine had taken their toll. Too many deaths, too many failures, Too many desperate surgeries carried out on blood-slick tables without understanding or hope. The people were tired, the doctors were exhausted, and the country, stretched thin by expansion and scarred by its own ambition, began to realize that medicine needed to change. Some of the earliest changes came not from cities, but from the fringes. Doctors in small towns, worn down by years of trial and error, began to look toward new ideas taking shape across the ocean. From Europe came whispers of invisible killers, of bacteria and microbes that lived on skin and tools and breath. At first, these ideas were mocked. Many doctors, especially the older ones, clung to the past. They believed disease came from bad air, from spiritual imbalance, from weakness of the blood. But the younger generation had seen too much. They had watched patients die in clean rooms and survive in filthy ones. They knew something else was at work. The idea that germs caused disease was revolutionary. It meant the enemy was not visible. It meant that even the cleanest hands could kill. And with this knowledge came a wave of change. Soap became sacred. Boiling water was used for instruments. Bandages were burned after use instead of folded and saved. Surgeons who once wiped their knives on their sleeves began to wear aprons soaked in carbolic acid. It was not perfect. It was not always consistent. But it was a beginning. In the cities, medical schools began to standardize. New regulations required proper training, proper facilities, and proper oversight. Students were taught to diagnose based on symptoms, not superstition. Anatomy was studied in bright rooms with labeled cadavers, not in sheds under flickering lanterns. Chemistry and biology were added to the curriculum. Exams were introduced. Licenses had to be earned. And while some decried this as elitism, as a betrayal of the rough and ready tradition of frontier doctors, others saw it as survival. If a man was to cut into another man's body, he should at least know what he was doing. The American Medical Association grew in power. Its members pushed for stricter laws, for oversight, for the right to define who was and who was not a physician. This came with conflict. Eclectic doctors, midwives, herbalists, and homeopaths were pushed to the margins. Some lost their right to practice. Others changed tactics, adapted, or went underground. The war over who had the right to heal had not ended. It had simply changed shape. Hospitals, once feared as places where people went to die, began to evolve. They were cleaned, staffed, organized. Nurses were trained not as servants, but as professionals. Florence Nightingale's principles of sanitation and care made their way across the Atlantic and into American wards. In larger towns, patients began to trust the idea of staying overnight under medical supervision. They no longer saw it as surrender. They saw it as a chance. These changes did not erase the past. The scars of 19th century medicine were deep. There were still doctors who clung to outdated methods. There were still towns where surgery was performed on kitchen tables with no anesthesia. There were still mothers who died in childbirth because the nearest hospital was too far away. But now, those tragedies began to be seen as failures of access, not fate. People began to ask why. And that question was more dangerous to the old ways than any new technique or discovery. There was also a shift in public expectation. People had seen too many miracle cures fail. Too many patent medicines leave families broken. They began to demand truth. Labels had to show ingredients. Advertisements were challenged. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, forcing companies to stop selling poison in fancy bottles. It was a small step, but it marked a new era. The age of the medicine show was ending. The age of accountability was beginning. Still, for all the progress, much of the West lagged behind. The land was too wide, the population too spread out. Doctors in remote areas often had no choice but to improvise. They relied on instinct, on memory, on whatever tools they had in their bags. But even there, reform was felt. A doctor might still ride out in the snow to treat a gunshot wound, but now he boiled his instruments before using them. A midwife might still deliver a baby alone in the dark, but now she washed her hands before touching the mother. Small acts, repeated again and again, created something close to a standard. Some of the frontier's most battle-worn doctors embraced the change with open arms. They had seen too much suffering to ignore the promise of something better. They read the journals. They wrote letters to the new schools. They tried to bridge the gap between tradition and science. Others retired quietly, unwilling to bend. Their time was ending. The world was moving on. Medicine would never be perfect. It would always be haunted by the mistakes of the past and limited by the knowledge of the present. But by the close of the 19th century, it had taken a hard, necessary turn. The days of dirty tools and guesswork were giving way to something cleaner, sharper, more disciplined. The reckoning had come, not with punishment, but with reflection. And the doctors who survived it carried forward a legacy of hard lessons, of pain transformed into progress. It would take decades more for true equity to reach all corners of the country, but the path had been carved. The reckoning had arrived not in anger, but in understanding. Reform was not an apology. It was a promise that the suffering had not been in vain. That the next time someone knocked on a door in the middle of the night, gasping and afraid, the hands that answered would be steadier, smarter, and just a little more prepared. By the time the 20th century stood on the horizon, the West had changed. The dust still clung to the boots of doctors who rode for miles to reach patients, and the scent of sweat and wood smoke still curled through the doorways of homesteads where babies were born and fevers broke. But something else lingered now, something quieter, harder to name. It was not pride exactly, it was not relief, it was a kind of hard-won clarity. After decades of pain, fear, and guesswork, the people who had lived through the darkest corners of frontier medicine understood the cost of survival. They had paid it in blood, and they were ready to expect more. The horrors had been real. No one who had seen a limb amputated without anesthesia, who had buried a child after a dose of poisoned syrup, or who had watched a loved one bleed out under the unsteady hands of an untrained doctor, would ever forget what had come before. These were not abstract memories. They were carved into the minds of entire generations. They were spoken of at dinner tables and whispered during childbirth. They were the reasons some people flinched at the sight of a bottle, or a blade, or a doctor's coat. And yet, out of that wreckage, hope had taken root. Not a naive hope, not the kind promised by snake oil peddlers or posters that promised a cure for everything. This was a quiet, patient hope, one built on progress that came too slowly and understanding earned too late. But it was real. It was in the way doctors began to wash their hands without being told, in the way midwives taught each other to boil their cloths and keep their fingernails trimmed. It was in the way families began to ask questions, to read labels, to say no when something didn't feel right. It was in the journals passed from one set of hands to another, pages worn thin with use, filled with lessons learned the hard way. The frontier did not breed sentiment. There was no time for it. But it did create memory. It forced people to remember what had failed so they could do better next time. And slowly, better began to take hold. Medical kits came with antiseptics. Schools taught not just anatomy, but hygiene and diagnostics. The idea of health shifted from endurance to prevention. Even in the smallest towns, even in the loneliest cabins, people began to believe that pain did not have to be the price of healing, that cutting a wound open did not mean it would be infected, that childbirth could be safe, that death was not always the only outcome. There was still loss. Of course there was. The human body remained fragile, and the frontier remained harsh. But now, when people died, it did not always feel like a failure. It felt like a tragedy, yes, but one that existed within the limits of what could be done, and that made all the difference. The wild experimentation and guesswork had not vanished, but it had been tempered by knowledge, by science, by the bravery of those who had endured and remembered and taught others not to make the same mistakes. The legacy of 19th century frontier medicine was not one of constant progress. It was not a straight line from ignorance to enlightenment. It was a jagged, blood-stained path, lined with makeshift tables, mislabeled bottles, and open graves. But it was also lined with lantern light, with stories shared by firelight, with journals scrawled in the margins of ledgers, with children who lived and mothers who recovered, and wounds that healed. And those stories mattered, because they were the foundation for everything that came next. Modern medicine did not emerge fully formed from sterile laboratories. It rose from dirt floors and shaking hands. From failures, from grit, from doctors who sat alone after a long ride home, covered in someone else's blood, replaying every decision they had made. From midwives who learned to keep breathing when the baby came too fast. From patients who survived and told the tale. And from those who did not, whose lives served as warnings, as lessons etched in grief. In the end, what the West gave medicine was perspective. It stripped away luxury, forced clarity, demanded answers. It showed what happened when science was absent and pain was constant. And in doing so, it created the hunger for something better. Not perfect, just better. Something a little cleaner, a little wiser, a little more human. As the new century arrived, with its hospitals and regulations, and wonder drugs still decades from becoming widespread, the people of the frontier were no longer passive recipients of medicine. They were participants, witnesses, carriers of hard-earned truth, and they stepped forward carrying that truth like a torch through the darkness. What came before would never be forgotten, nor should it be. The horrors of 19th century medicine in the Wild West were brutal and at times unforgivable, but they were not meaningless. They were the price of progress, and progress came. It always does, though never fast enough. It arrives in the hands of those who do not look away, and when it does, the ground it grows from is not clean. It is soaked in everything that came before, everything we survived. And that is where hope begins, in survival, in memory, in the quiet, unshakable decision to do better next time. Good night.